Next up is a certain king that some of you guys may actually be a fan of. But it's King Togwaggle in his applications in Tog Druid. And I'm going to go ahead and put this particular wild list that was popular around like August of 2020. But I'm going to go ahead and talk up from my perspective of when I brought this deck to an actual tournament in DreamHack Atlanta. I think it was 2018. It was 2018. But regardless, this was a really, really interesting deck that I thought was really, really cool because this was like you were asking yourself if you're bringing a big druid, whether or not you're bringing like a Mali druid or a Tog druid in terms of like thick armor, controlling the board, and then having like some kind of combo in order to win the game. And Tog druid is just like one of those decks that I thought was just so interesting that if you were able to play this deck perfectly, you would do nothing but win the game. So like you had like naturalizes and stuff like that in order to like help you with like destroying your opponent's hand. So that way when you play Togwaggle, the ransom wouldn't be a problem in case you couldn't play Azalina in the same turn. But if you look in what Togwaggle has become down the line, it's a lot more focused on just being able to draw the deck as soon as possible and then just give your opponent the fatigue deck. So this is a deck that went from controlling every single aspect of the game to just go to the end of your deck as soon as possible. And some decks don't even like really play Azalina anymore. So like Tog Druid is such an interesting druid mechanic that I'm going to go ahead and put it at a B tier. The reason why it's a B tier is because it has lots of different ways of being played. It has different ways of being built, and as well as like a very, very interesting game mechanic. Like you really don't see a lot of cards like Togwaggle in literally any kind of game because Hearthstone really likes to hammer in on the electronic media. So therefore, like you can't just make a magic card be like, yeah, by the way, give me your deck and I'll give you mine and I'll give you this one card, and if you play this one card, then we'll switch them around again. Like that doesn't happen. So this is just like a great example of Hearthstone being able to feel like a unique game because it has a card like Togwaggle to where you can steal your opponent's deck and then suddenly it's a completely different game at that point. So I'm putting it at a B tier because it may be degenerate for some people because they don't like, being milled automatically. Like there's APM Togwaggle decks that are just aimed to just, give your opponent fatigue and then make them draw fatigue damage with like Solar Eclipse into naturalizes and stuff like that. But aside from that, Tog Druid is such an interesting mechanic to where it's not degenerate in terms of what I believe it's supposed to do. It's degenerate in terms of what it does, but it's not degenerate in terms of how you play it every single time. So it's not going to kill you every single time you go up against it. So B tier seems pretty fair to me just because it's not meta defining and you're not going to see it every single day. Next up is probably one of the most recent decks on here aside from Lunacy Mage, but it is APM Miracle Mage. This is a deck I was actually able to do pretty well with. I had a 100% win rate when I was playing it on my last stream with it. So this deck is definitely very, very powerful, but the power of this deck not only relies in the Flame Waker capabilities, but it's also because of refreshing Spring Water as well as Incanter's Flow. And this deck could almost deck itself out as early as like turn 6, I believe, if you have like the absolutely perfect setup. So this deck is almost an S tier, but I'm going to go ahead and put it in the A tier only because this deck is still relatively new, but it's definitely a degenerate deck in Wild. Like you just literally are able to kill your opponent as early as turn 6 sometimes with just Flame Waker damage, not even like through drawing out your entire deck. So like just being able to cheat mana, being able to just deal damage with literally every single one of your cards. Like it's classic Flame Waker Mage. It just does it really, really fast now. And now you don't even need the quest. So that's pretty cool. You don't need the quest in order to actually kill your opponent nowadays. And Quest Mage is kind of slow. So Miracle Mage, if you're looking for something cool and wild, definitely would highly recommend it because I had a ton of fun with it. And it's actually a pretty intricate deck. So that's another reason why it's not S tier is because you can't just blindly play this deck and just like play every single spell. And like even though I misplayed with it a little bit, its outreach is, its output is ridiculous. So I have to put it in the A tier for that reason. Next up is a deck that I honestly didn't think was that degenerate, but somebody on the Twitter post said that they did not like Shivala OTK Holy Wrath Paladin. So I'm just going to go ahead and tell you this is a C tier, and I believe this is actually one of the most fair combo decks that has ever existed in Hearthstone's meta, only because you had one way of being able to deal your damage, and it wasn't like you won immediately, it was you dealt 25 damage. So like it was a really, really interesting deck because the way to think about this deck is that like, oh yeah, you have 25 damage in one turn, but if you did it right, you had 50 damage over the course of 2 turns. So even Control Warrior, a deck that's like, oh, I don't have to worry about, you know, getting killed from 30 HP. I'm absolutely fine. I've got plenty of armor cards. Suddenly that matchup becomes a lot more interesting and a lot more like, you know, it's not as straightforward in order to analyze, so it becomes a lot more of a spectacle in order to actually watch. So watching old-fashioned OTK Paladin with Holy Wraths and Control Warrior with Boom back in the day was pretty cool, not gonna lie. Like, there was some pretty, there was a lot of interesting matchups that I saw where, like, one really cool example that I can think of was when, like, Baleful Banker into Baleful Banker into Baleful Banker infinitely, so that way somebody could deal with like the cards that Warrior like generated and stuff like that. And I believe it was Eddie he was able to do something like that. So just being able to see that cool of an application in a deck to where, like, even if you're not trying to kill your opponent with the OTK, you can still do other ways of killing your opponent. I really love decks like that. So I believe it's a solid C tier because even though you did have the times where you just ripped Holy Wrath and you just killed your opponent like it was nothing, there are so many more games to where you really had to earn your win with this deck. So for that reason, I believe the Shrivala OTK is absolutely fine as a deck, and so C tier is more than fair. Next up is a Warlock deck that absolutely just ruled the game. It's Snip Snap Lock. So Snip Snap was a deck that was, you know, there were ways to kill your opponent on turn 4 with this deck, and it actually became a problem because people were literally, I don't think they were botting, but they were doing something to where they could increase their APM with this deck to where it was literally like, you were literally a machine who was getting it frame perfect. Like, there was no human way to be able to replicate this. So that kind of created some problems. But I'm just going to go ahead and tell you that Snip Snap Warlock, I mean, SS for Snip Snap. Like, it goes in the SS tier, dude. Like, this was just an absolutely bonkers deck because turn 4 OTKs of this capacity should not be a thing. And this was one of those decks to where, like, if you had any mech on the field, literally any mech, if it was a 1/1, you were dead. You were dead if that minion survived and your opponent had the combo. This was a degenerate deck. This is my definition of degeneracy in Hearthstone when you want to try and compare like Deck of Lunacy and like a lot of these other decks to what Snip Snap Warlock was. Because this was a deck to where it's like if you played this deck correctly, you had like an 80% win rate almost guaranteed against almost everything. This deck almost had no weaknesses from what I can remember and could literally kill you on turn 4. And I think, okay, actually going back, I think the weakness was like Quest Mage if it had the nuts. Keyword if it had the nuts. So it's like, this deck just enabled the most degenerate meta that has ever grazed the wild, the wild meta. And it was just like, going up against Warlock was not something you wanted at all. Like, even more so than, like, when you see, like, Void Ward and stuff like that, or when you see, like, Gul'dan. Like, this was just a deck that thrived on being able to just do the most ridiculous things that Hearthstone has ever been able to see in its history. So, Snip Snap Warlock being SS tier, where else are we going to put this? Above SS? Like, I mean, we don't have an SSS tier, but I think this just definitely goes on the top because of, it was so tilting to go up against this deck. Like, I don't even want to remember it, man. Next up is actually a deck that I thought was absolutely unbeatable back in the beginning years of Hearthstone, and that is Millrogue. Millrogue is a deck that has always emerged, at least I've always seen it. I've always seen it in every single meta to some capacity because Millrogue with like Colite Oracle, Shadow Steps, it's just a very, very interesting deck, and there's not a lot of ways to be able to mill in Hearthstone. So, and I actually really like these decks. It kind of like bred my love of like combo decks because in order to mill people, you had to have like a specific combination of cards, and you had to do it at the right time. So, why is this on here as a degenerate deck? Well, because, you know, milling your cards is a pretty degenerate thing to do. In fact, it's probably the most degenerate archetype that's ever existed in any kind of card game because getting, like, literally burning your opponent's cards, being like, hey, this nice Exodia, these Exodia pieces you needed for your combo, by the way, yeah, just throw them in the garbage, by the way, because they're no longer in this game anymore. So it becomes very degenerate whenever you have anything get taken out of your deck. But I believe that Millrogue goes in the A tier, and the reason why it's being like placed above like Ticketus and stuff like that is because there are some decks like Control Priest that literally can't deal with Millrogue, and like obviously like they can't deal with Ticketus either. But drawing cards and just immediately getting rid of even more than 5, more than not, like there are lots of times where like you can literally kill your entire opponent's deck and then make them draw fatigue. So I feel like it's a little bit worse than Ticketus in that regard, but like Millrogue itself is a very, very interesting archetype, so I like it for that reason. I also like Ticketus Warlock, so it's like little column A, little column B, but the power level of this deck has just been a lot more consistent and a lot more frustrating to go up against, and some people just really don't like seeing Collide Oracle, so that probably is like another reason why I'm putting it up so high. But Milrogue being an A tier instead of an S tier makes a lot of sense because it doesn't absolutely break the game in my opinion, and it doesn't make you, I mean, it makes some people want to quit the game, but it's not like this next deck that I'm about to bring up. The next deck that I'm talking about is probably going to be something that is below Secret Mage and Death Rattle Hunter in terms of how much I hate it, but it is Doom in the Tomb Evolved Shaman. For those of you who are not aware with what Doom in the Tomb was, there's only one thing to keep in mind. Evolve was a card that was playable in Standard. So is Emperor Thaurissan, but it didn't matter, bro, because Evolve was in the meta, and Desert Hare was printed in this freaking expansion, so all you had to do was mulligan for Desert Hare and Evolve. If you were on coin, you could do this on turn 3, but on your turn 4, you could literally just play the freaking bunny, and then evolve it, and then you had freaking 3/4 drops as early as turn 4, and how is anybody supposed to deal with that? It warped the meta. It was the most frustrating deck that I've ever dealt with in my competitive Hearthstone career, and it's part of the reason why I really don't go hard on Open Cups anymore, because I ended up getting second place in an Open Cup during this time, and if I would have won that next game, I would have been able to qualify for that Masters Tour, which I believe was the second one at the time. Yeah, it was Arlington. It was either the second one or the third one. But I ended up losing I ended up losing the final round, giving me a second placement in that tournament. It was the last one of that season, so it was extremely frustrating for that. And I have been dealing with this deck for the entire meta, and then suddenly, because of this deck, I didn't make it into the tournament. It was a very frustrating deck. It was the absolute definition of a coin flip, to where if you had it on turn 3, well, congratulations, you won the game, unless you got really bad 4-drops, and 4-drops back then were pretty above average, if you want my honest opinion. Like, most of them were like 3/4s at least, or 4/4s, something like that. So S tier for sure. The only reason why it's not SS tier is because this deck kind of did die in power level a little bit. Although in the recent meta, we did have Boxbind Knuckles, which is very, very reminiscent of what this deck could accomplish. Same cards that were problematic, yada, yada, yada. But the only reason why it's not SS tier is because Secret Mage, I believe, is a perfect example of what's fundamentally not fun in Hearthstone. And while Evolve can be a pretty cool mechanic, I just don't like it when it's literally as soon as turn 3 and turn 4 and automatically wins the game. I'm fine with Evolve Shaman being an archetype as long as you just don't win immediately when you pop off your Evolve. That's stupid. I don't like it. I don't like those kind of games. Please, never make Evolve ever be a thing again, please. Next up, we have the absolute definition of a high roll, and it is Spiteful Druid. This was a deck that was just completely aimed to just, ramp up as quickly as possible. Starting to see a common theme here with Druid decks, by the way, in terms of degeneracy. But yeah, you ramp up as quickly as you can, and then you just played Spiteful Summoner in order to pull, hopefully Ultimate Infestation from your deck. I mean, you don't pull it, but you reveal it, and then suddenly you get a 10-drop. And a lot of the times, you got I think it was Tyrannus, which was a 12/12 that couldn't be targeted by spells. So if you got that, you just kind of won games. And there was a time, kind of like what I was saying earlier with Druid just being on top. This was one of those Druid decks that was just absolutely really, 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 really good. Also, it had Kelazeth in it, so you played that on 2. So all of your minions, you had a deck of 27 minions, I think, 27, 26, because you had 2 copies of 2 spells, if you even had that. So yeah, this deck was it was complete powerhouse, because you just scammed games. This is probably the definition of Scam Druid, if you want my honest opinion back in the day. Even more so than, Jade Druid, because, at least Jade Druid had to build up their 1/1s. If you just drew the Spiteful and you had... And, this is back when Spiteful was 7 mana, by the way. Keep that in mind. So, 2 ramp cards into Spiteful was... It was good. So, even though I've, really talked up this deck a lot, I believe that it goes in the B tier because it had a lot of, it had weaknesses back in the day, and it wasn't as consistent as, Jade Druid. And nowadays, we just don't see Spiteful decks seeing a lot of play. Even now, even after we've seen, essentially a power crept version of it, to where it just hard draws the spell from your deck. So it's Spiteful Druid was unfun to go up against, but just look at everything else that's on this list right now. Do you really think that Spiteful Druid is worse than a lot of this other stuff? Is it worse than Doom in the Tomb Evolved Shaman? No, it is not. This next deck is only in here because a good friend of mine said how much he hated it, and well, I'm sorry, Ridiculous Hat, but I'm putting Taunt Priest in the C tier. And the reason why he's going in the C tier is because even though you had Master Oakheart, High Rolls, and stuff like that, compare it to a deck like Taunt Druid, suddenly Taunt Druid becomes a lot more degenerate than what Wall Priest was at the time. And like, I mean, I know it's kind of unfair to judge those two decks side by side, but like in terms of like what degeneracy is, in my opinion, like I would have rather seen like Xerix Priest or something like that on this list, but nobody brought it up, so like now that I'm just now thinking about it, I'd probably put Xerix Priest in like an S tier, honestly. But Taunt Priest itself is just, it had one way of being able to be played, and I believe this was back when Psychic Scream was a thing, so suddenly the power level of this deck kind of goes down a little bit more, but the power of this deck was not up against like Priest and stuff like that, it was against other aggro decks, and that's why a lot of people definitely did not like this archetype, because if they just had taunts every single turn and then they played Oakheart, it was like, I'm never winning this game, please release me from this mortal coil, I'm tired of seeing Anduin's ugly face. But for that reason, like, I think that Taunt Priest is just, it compared to Taunt Druid again, man, like, it just doesn't seem as degenerate. Like, I just don't think it's as degenerate as everything else that we're seeing on this list, so I have to put it in the C tier. Sorry, Ridiculous Hat, feel free to at me on Twitter with your opinion on this, but I just don't see it, man. Next is another deck that I'm not really sure is 100% degenerate, but Dead Man's Hand Warrior is something else that somebody had said in the Twitter post. So I'm just gonna tell you again, like C tier, like I don't see it. I don't see this deck being degenerate because I believe this is probably one of the most fair warrior decks that has ever existed in Hearthstone's conception. Only because you literally have to build this deck with every single situation in mind. I believe this is the perfect definition of letting a good player be good. There's literally an entire, I think, a Discord server or a Reddit, or a subreddit that is completely devoted, I'm sorry, to Dead Man's Hand Warrior and playing it, like, only playing that and playing it optimally. Figuring out what other cards you're supposed to run, how you're supposed to be able to win some games. Like, this is a very, very intriguing deck, a very hard deck to play, and, like, I've only really seen somebody like Dane be able to play this deck to absolute efficiency, or being able to even go for some memes and stuff like that. Like, Dead Man's Hand Warrior is the perfect definition of letting a perfect player be good, and I don't believe that's degenerate. I believe that that is a fair and balanced card, so it has to go in the C tier just because, like, look at something like Doom and the Tomb Shaman, look at something like Jade Druid, look at something like Secret Mage. Those are degenerate. Those are 100% degenerate because you're locked out. This deck needs to work to lock you out. So, in that aspect, 100% fair deck, not degenerate, goes in the C tier. Goes in the C tier. So this next deck is a pretty good example of what I mean by degenerate, and it is Darkest Hour Warlock. This is a deck that just aimed to do one thing really, really well, and when you did it, you cheated out. Oh god, I don't even know how much mana you cheated out, but you had Yashiraj, you had Big Demons, you had thick amount of attack. Like, this deck was just, I mean, it was high roll Warlock, to be honest. Like, it was kind of hard to believe that this was, like, actually, like, top tier for a little bit. I can't remember, like, what were the other decks that were, like, trying to keep it at bay at the moment, but, like, during that meta, it was just really, really weird to see this kind of deck just do well, because Darkest Hour had literally never seen play, and then suddenly I think Tice got high rolled against it, and then a bunch of people just realized, ooh, this is pretty funny, let's keep playing this deck. But this is going to be in the A tier just because it's 100% a degenerate deck. If you don't get the high roll, you don't win the game, so therefore you don't really have a strategy outside of just cheat the mana. And that's kind of like that's the common theme, if you guys haven't realized it yet, is that degeneracy doesn't always equate to power level. It equates to how easy you're able to pull off these combos. And this was just a combo you pulled off very, very quickly back when Blood Bloom was 2 mana. And, well, you can't really do that anymore now, can you? So for that, it goes in the A tier just because it was competitively good, it was annoying to go up against, and the amount of mana that it cheated was just unreal. Next up is a Hearthstone classic. It is Pirate Warrior. It is probably the aggro deck that has made the most amount of people upset outside of, like, Undertaker Hunter and maybe Aggro Shaman. I would say that those are probably the 3 most prominent aggro decks that have made people hate the game just the most. Pirate Warrior and its conception back when, oh god, I think Old Gods came out, was just, oh my god, this was like the deck, dude. It worked so well. I played this in Tespa in order to stomp on these kids. I didn't know what they were doing. Like, Pirate Warrior was just the absolute definition of the noob slayer, because if you didn't, like, if you messed up one of the turns against Pirate Warrior in the control matchup, bro, you just died. You just died, because freaking upgrading your weapon back then was an ability that wasn't really as common. So when you had like War Axe, when you had oh god, I think some of them had Death Spite and stuff like that. But like, that and like Arcanite Reaper, like you just had those cards, you just upgraded them, and just suddenly you chunk out so much life in one turn, and then Leroy comes down and just wins the game for you. Like, this is actually a deck that one of my good friends ended up playing for the very first time, and when this deck ended up getting nerfed, she just didn't play the game anymore. So it's like, it's kind of interesting to see it in that perspective, but there was a lot more people that probably quit the game because of how frustrating this deck was, and it was probably the reason why Small Time Buccaneer ended up getting the nerf, because good lord, that card was busted when you played it on turn 1. So for that reason, Pirate Warrior goes in the S tier, because it was competitively viable, it was annoying to go up against, it did the same thing over and over and over and over again, and you sometimes died in less than 2 minutes, and when you fought this deck literally 5 times in a row, you're going crazy in less than 15 minutes, and like, that's just not healthy for you. We've talked about a lot of high roll decks today, but we really haven't talked about a lot of high roll hunter decks. And so this next deck that I'm going to highlight is Spell Hunter with the Yashiraj Barnes combo. So this is a deck that like kind of got a decent amount of ground. Oh god, I can't remember what expansion exactly it was. But back when this deck was really, really good, it was just like Spell Hunter itself was a solid archetype because of the Emerald Spellstone being fully triggered at like, if you were able to play 2 secrets and then on turn 5 you had 3/3s on the field, like it just won the game if your opponent didn't have AoE. But then there was another high roll that you had that was that was really good in this deck, to where you played Barnes and you just pulled Yashiraj because it's the only minion in your deck. So every now and again, if you draw Yashiraj, it'd be kind of upsetting, but if you played Barnes on turn 4, it's literally just like the Priest deck, except in Hunter, and now you have even more aggressive strategies to help the Hunter get there. You also have the Death Knight, so you have lots of ways of being able to generate minions. But I would say that this deck is not as degenerate as a lot of the other decks that we've been seeing on here, so I'm going to go ahead and feel comfortable putting it in the C tier, because this wasn't a deck that thrived 100% on the Barnes high roll. Like, yes, obviously that's important. I'm not saying that that's not important, but this deck had legitimate ways of winning the game without even caring if you drew your Barnes, because you had the Death Knight and you had the Spellstone. You also had like some other cards, I think like To My Side, and I think Call to the Wild as well. So you had lots of ways of being able to threaten damage onto the boards. Like, this was just like, not really like an aggressive hunter, but it was like a mid-range hunter almost, to like where you built up a board and then suddenly you just dealt insane amounts of damage all at once. So it feels pretty fair when I explain it like that, right? So that's the main reason why I feel I feel fine putting it in the C tier, because unlike this next deck that we're about to talk about, it doesn't seem degenerate in my eyes. This next deck is actually one of the most degenerate decks that I can think about in Hearthstone's history, and it is Inner Fire Priest. And well, just to tell you, yoink, it goes up to the SS tier, because this is a deck that like has always been a problem until they decided to address Divine Spirit as a card, because doubling in Hearthstone is a very scary thing, especially when Priest has very, very high HP minions. So like suddenly doubling that and then putting Inner Fire on that is just busted. But the main reason why this deck was just not fun to go up against, like, the deck that I'm showing you on the screen right now is the one with a Met, and it's all about just being able to play that, and then suddenly every single one of your minions have this really, really high HP cost. But another way that this deck was really, really infuriating was back when you had the Twilight Kobold, and you were able to just make any minion have 2 attack. You played Potion of Illusion onto it. I'm sorry, not Potion of Illusion, Potion of Madness. So you would take it, and then you could double it, and since it would have charge, since you could attack with it, you could literally just make any one of your opponent's minions into a perfect target for the Inner Fire Priest combo. So if you're like a Warlock and you had like a Void Lord on the field, and you're like, yeah, I'm safe behind this Void Lord, and they just took my Void Lord and they just buffed it to oh god, is that 36 attack? Yeah, that's 36 attack, and they just killed me with it. Yikes, man. My own minion that was supposed to defend me ended up killing me? Yeah, that's not an archetype I can get behind. And then, like, you just think about all the other archetypes that Inner Fire Priest has enabled throughout the years. Like, Combo Priest is just, oh my god, no. I do not like Combo Priest unless it has spell damage and Velen involved. Thank you very much. And even then, that's pretty degenerate. But Inner Fire Priest has been a deck that I've hated almost since the very beginning of Hearthstone. It's a deck that always reared its ugly head until they finally dealt with the card. Meta-defining, annoying to go up against, and repetitive as hell. Definitely goes in the SS tier, because I cannot believe that this deck went on for so long. And again, like, I lost to Evolve Shaman and Combo Priest back in the cup that I ended up getting second place in. So it's part of the reason why I also hate this deck, but it was just fire to the ever blooming flare that is my hatred for Inner Fire specifically. I mean, Divine Spirit was the problem card, but when you saw Inner Fire, you're just like, yep, gone, and didn't like it for that reason. So SS tier seems more than appropriate. Next up is actually my favorite degenerate deck that has ever been a thing in Hearthstone, and that is Turtle Mage. I don't care what you guys have to say about Turtle Mage. I did not want this deck to be nerfed because it was so fun. It was probably actually the most fun that I've ever had in Hearthstone, was coming up with memes that really highlighted the Turtle Mage archetype. And not even like going for like competitively viable decks. I'm talking about playing like Hakar, playing oh god, Dragon Ball Scorcher, and playing, oh god, there's like another card that was part of that combo, but like, I had like this really cool combo to where I played a card, I destroyed my board, I filled up my hand, and then suddenly every single time, like, I don't draw the bloods because I have a full hand and my opponent gets all these bloods added to their deck. You were not going to get anything else, like, you were not going to get any other, memes out of this except for out of Turtle Mage. Like, it is such a cool deck. It was so awesome to just literally throw in a battle cry and somehow make a lethal clip out of it. And then it turned out to be one of the most like busted decks during the Skullman's Academy meta, because good lord, Potion of Illusion with old school Hortolan was just, oh, it was so good. Talk about a cash money archetype. But it definitely goes in the S tier because of how degenerate it was. It was very uninteractive because in the wild format you had infinite ice blocks. Even I didn't like that. I'll tell you that right now. Like, I loved the standard version of this deck, and I also like the wild version, you know, to meme and stuff like that. But the standard version was just such an awesome, intricate deck. And the moment that you drew like the Potion of Illusion, you were like, yikes! I need to figure out how I'm actually gonna win this game. But it was such a cool deck. I'm very sad that we had to see it go, but my heart will always go out to Tortolan Pilgrim. Rest in peace, my friend. We had some great memories together. You definitely deserve a spot in the S tier because you were the degenerate king. And last and certainly not least is something that was actually suggested by Zeddy, and he said any priest deck that contains cards. And well, that definitely goes in the SSS tier. And even though I said I didn't have one, we're making it specifically for this priest archetype, because who likes priest? Let's just go ahead and just get rid of it from the game because we just don't like priest anymore. Mindrender Lucia would be deleted, Prophet Velen would be deleted, Mind Blast would be deleted, Psychic Scream would be deleted. There's a lot of interesting deletions that would be made if priest were just no longer a class. And well, some people don't like that there's 10 classes in Hearthstone. Why don't we just boot priest out of here and go back to the classic 9? I think that might be a good idea. But any priest deck goes in the SSS tier. Absolutely unplayable, absolutely degenerate. Cannot believe anybody would play priest. But that is all of the decks that were on the Twitter post. I know there's a lot of other degenerate decks that we could have covered here, so feel free to put in what you believe is the most degenerate deck down in the comments below, and let me know about anything that I missed, because I'm perfectly okay with doing another one of these videos highlighting some more degenerate decks in Hearthstone's history. But I thought this was a lot of fun, so hopefully you guys enjoyed this type of video. If you do enjoy this, feel free to like and to subscribe to the YouTube channel to be updated about any content that we happen to come out with. There's no deck codes down in the Discord or down in the description below, but if you want to join the Discord, or if you want to go ahead and follow the Twitch stream, all the links are down below for you guys to be able to check those out. Feel free to let me know of any other kind of tier list videos you'd like me to do, and well, I'm gonna keep at it with coming up with more video ideas that are more than just gameplay. So hopefully I'll see you guys for the next video. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time. Be degenerate, my friends.